Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the European Parliament Intergroup on Climate Change, Biodiversity and Sustainable Development, I'm happy to welcome you to today's event addressing the future of fighting against wildlife trafficking in Europe. This is a very timely discussion as unprecedented levels of poaching and illegal trade in wildlife have greatly increased high-level political attention all around the world. So, before we kick off today's discussion, I would like to take the opportunity to thank MEP Ms. Eleonora Evi for kindly hosting this event, as well as colleagues from WWF and Traffic for kindly co-organizing this webinar. Prior to passing the floor to Ms. Katalin Ketsenaj from Traffic for a short presentation of the SWIPE project, followed by MEP Ms. Evi's opening remarks, I would like to let you know that today's discussion will be moderated by Dr. Coleman O'Creadine, Policy Manager on Wildlife Practice at WWF International. At the same time, as we are very interested in hearing more from our audience as well, I would like to invite participants to send us your questions during the event. For that, you can use the Q&As option, choosing the All Panelists tool. Within your question, please make sure to also note the speaker to whom your question is best addressed, so that we can facilitate on behalf of the Secretariat of the Intergroup a fruitful discussion to follow. So once again, thank you all for joining us today. Katalin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And so let me share my presentation. Please allow me to share my presentation. Thank you. Change the display settings if all goes well. Bear with me for a moment. So hopefully it's all okay now. People are nodding. That's good. Okay, so very warm welcome, everyone. I would like to really warmly welcome you on behalf of the SWIPE project, because this project is hosting this event, and on behalf of the SWIPE partnership. So I would like to very briefly introduce to you this project. And as you can see, this stands for Successful Wildlife Crime Prosecution in Europe, and it's an EU life-funded project. So, to move to the next slide. So this is a 3-year, so this is a 3-year project that we already in the first year of implementation, or finished the first year of implementation. It started last September last year, and it's a project that is taking place in 11 European countries, some of which are EU member states, but also some neighboring countries are included in our scope. In terms of the partnership, so we have 13 partners in this project. You can see them listed there, so several WWF offices, FFI, the Judicial Academy in Croatia, and the State Attorney's Office in Croatia are also partners. So why did we feel there was a need for a project like SWIPE on wildlife crime prosecutions? So the reason we started the project was because we felt that wildlife crime was not and is not a priority when compared to other crime areas. We also felt that there was no comprehensive data available on the extent of this issue, especially when it comes to understanding how many cases are detected, how many of these reach more in-depth investigation and then prosecution and potentially sanctioning in courts. Also, we were aware of the complex legal framework with EU-level regulations and directives in place, as well as national regulatory frameworks. So we felt there was a need for specialized knowledge related to wildlife crime. And we also felt that the cooperation between the different authorities is particularly important in this field, because they need to work in a concerted and coordinated effort to address this crime. And we felt that this cooperation had some room for improvement, especially also across countries when it comes to cooperation. So the aims of the project are really to discourage and ultimately reduce wildlife crime by improving compliance with the EU environmental law and through increasing the number of successfully prosecuted offences. So the project activities include data collection on wildlife crime, also best practices, and we try to do that through a participatory process, which involves the different stakeholders, interviews, and focus group discussions. We are analyzing all this information that we're collecting, and we'll be presenting them in the form of a national report first, so for each of the 11 countries. This is really the stage we're at the moment. We are hoping to finalize these national reports by the end of the year, beginning of next year, and these will be available in English and also in the national languages of the 11 countries that we're covering. And then we'll try to draw out some cross-cutting issues that emerge in several of the countries, and we'll draw up a European summary report from this. And the findings of the European summary report we're planning to discuss in a European conference where we bring together the various experts and practitioners to further discuss those challenges and issues. And based on also our findings, we're planning to conduct capacity building, develop training materials, and really deliver the trainings as well. We have also developed a portal, stopwildlifecrime.eu, where we're going to make available the relevant project outputs and, for example, the training materials, but already now several useful resources are available on this website. And also we are aiming to inform the relevant policies, and that's why we're here today, because we feel that the action plan, the EU action plan against wildlife trafficking is, and in particular its objective 2.1, which is to increase capacity to combat wildlife trafficking, all parts of the enforcement chain and judiciary, is very relevant to the aims of our project. And we have a number of other activities which I don't really have time to go into, but really to give you a flavor of what SWIPE is about. And finally, to say that thank you for all the speakers and also to all the participants who are joining us today. And we very much look forward to hearing the speakers, but also hearing from the audience in the questions and answer sessions at the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Katalin, for this information, but also for the presentation of the SWIPE project. So seamlessly, I would like to transition to our next speaker of today's event, who is MEP Ms. Eleonora Evi, host of today's webinar. MEP Ms. Evi is a Greens MEP and a member of the European Parliament since 2014. Ms. Evi currently is a member of the Committee on the Environment, Public Health and Food Safety, and also the Committee for the Inquiry on the Protection of Animals During Transport, ANIT. So Ms. Evi, it's with great pleasure to have you with us today, and the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and a warm welcome also from my side, and a big thank you in particular to the European Parliament Intergroup on Climate Change, Biodiversity and Sustainable Development for having given me this opportunity to host this wonderful event on a topic that I consider extremely important. A little bit of the context for the beneficial of our audience in particular. Wildlife trafficking is one of the drivers of the dramatic loss of biodiversity that we are seeing today. The EU is a market, and it is a critical transit point for the legal and illegal trade of wildlife and wildlife commodities, where millions of plant and animal specimens worth billions of euros and that are internationally traded every year. Let's not forget the growing trend for exotic pet keeping, which has significantly increased the likelihood of spillover events in the EU and caused the wildlife population decline around the world, not to mention the risk of disease transmission to native wild animals. Let's also not forget that in some EU countries, circuses are still allowed to use wild animals, which facilitates the illicit trade of endangered pet species and their parts, as monitoring these animals has proven to be extremely hard. But the EU is not only a market for wildlife trafficking, which affects the preservation of animals and plant species abroad. Europe's wildlife itself is also directly threatened by illegal taking from the wild, including poaching, trapping, or illegal fishing for threatened wildlife within and across EU borders. So we have now a window of opportunity. We now have an important moment that we cannot afford to miss. The European Commission has committed to revise and improve the EU Action Plan against wildlife trafficking and has presented much needed targets and renewed ambition on biodiversity preservation in the framework of both the European Green Deal and, of course, in the 2030 biodiversity strategy. So 2022 will be an important year for biodiversity, both at the global level, with the Convention of Biological Diversity negotiations and the CEST COP19, and in Europe, with many wildlife trade relevant policy files on the table of the European Parliament and the EU Council, such as for example, the revised Environmental Crime Directive, the Anti-Deforestation Law, and the Corporate Due Diligence and Corporate Accountability Directive. We need to make sure that the EU matches the level of ambition of its action with the seriousness of the challenges that we are facing. Indeed, we are finally starting to talk about the climate emergency, but often in doing so, we tend to overlook the other major crisis, which is just as important, the biodiversity crisis. So the success of the EU Action Plan against wildlife trafficking, which is currently undergoing a public consultation, will depend on the financial and human resources allocated to its implementation. The EU institutions and the EU member states should allocate dedicated budgets both at EU and national level for its implementation. The future action plan should be supported by a comprehensive monitoring and evaluation system in order to measure progress and ensure accountability toward its implementation. And member states should be fully committed to strictly implement it within their borders, with national law enforcement agencies fully mobilized, trained and specialized to tackle wildlife crime as a serious crime. In the meantime, we should not forget about the legal wildlife trade that still exists in the EU, which doesn't need to be strictly regulated, but rather terminated once and for all. Let's take the example of the legal trade of ivory in the EU. The existence of a legal market for ivory stimulate demand for and provide a means by which legal ivory from poached elephants can be laundered into trade. Allowing the sale of ivory reinforces its social acceptability and makes it a desirable product to own, further fueling the illegal market and stimulating transnational wildlife crime. Finally, I believe that the adoption of a EU-positive list of species which are allowed to be kept as companion animals and an EU-wide ban on the use of wild animals in circuses will also positively contribute to put an end to wildlife trafficking. And I hope that the Commission that is present today can take on board these proposals. And as a conclusion, and a call to action as well, this event wants to be a platform and a space for knowledge sharing and constructive debate on how to effectively fight wildlife trafficking and be better at preserving our biodiversity. This event also wants to underline the importance of the revision of the EU Action Plan against wildlife trafficking and can be a call to action for all the interested stakeholders to participate in the consultation and provide their latest insights and evidences. And in this spirit, we have united speakers from the European Commission, member states, authorities, NGOs, and I hope that today, together, we can identify priorities, obstacles, best practices, and move on a step closer to our common goal. I really look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Evi, for setting the scene with regards to today's discussion, but also for underlining the timely nature of today's event with reference to policy developments, both at the international but also European level. On this note, I would like to introduce our poll for this event, which will appear any moment soon on your screens. So we would like to ask our audience today the specific question of how would you evaluate the progress made by the EU Action Plan against wildlife trafficking in the fight against wildlife trafficking. And for that, you can rate from 1 to 5, marking 1 for no progress at all, 2 for little progress, 3 for some progress, but more efforts are needed, 4 standing for substantial progress, and 5 for marking that its objective has been fully achieved. The results of that poll will be announced during the Q&A session. So please feel free to take a moment to reply to this poll anytime you prefer during the hour to follow. On this note, I'm happy to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Peter Ksonka, on behalf of the European Commission. Specifically, Mr. Ksonka is the Deputy Director at the Directorate General for Justice and Consumers of the European Commission. In the past, Mr. Ksonka has also worked at the International Monetary Fund as a Senior Counsel and as Deputy Head of Division at the Council of Europe. So without further ado, Mr. Ksonka, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ilias. I hope you can hear me.
Yes,
very
well.
Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you very much. Good afternoon to all of you. I'm going to reveal something, which is that I replied to the poll with reply number C or number 3, and that shows the Commission's attitude to a large extent. We think there is some progress, but more efforts are needed. And I'm sure most of you will share this assessment. First of all, thank you very much to all of you for being here today, and thank you to the Parliament for inviting us, the Commission, to speak briefly about the Environmental Crime Directive and what we're doing to make it more effective. And this is indeed what I'm going to address briefly. This is a very timely discussion, and it's a very important topic. And I'm very glad to see some familiar faces on the screen, indeed, among the members of the panel. Speak after my compatriot Katalin on that panel as well. The Environmental Crime Directive is indeed the main European Union instrument, directive, which regulates the main categories of environmental crime. There are 9 categories which are regulated by the directive, which dates back to 2008. So it's been there for 13 years. One of the 9 categories concerns, actually there are 2 categories which concern wildlife trafficking. It's Article 3, paragraph F, which is the killing and destruction of wild fauna and specimens, and then paragraph 3G, which concerns the trading in specimens of protected wild fauna and flora species or parts of derivatives thereof. And here comes the important exception: except for cases where the conduct concerns a negligible quantity of such specimens and has a negligible impact on the conservation status of the species. So there is a limitation in the directive, a limitation which was implemented by most of our member states, so that the trading has to concern something which is non-negligible, something which is important. In non-negligible cases, member states were not obliged to criminalize, and therefore there are no criminal sanctions in most of our member states for trading in species if it does not concern a certain amount of those protected species. So that's the first comment. We have European law regulating wildlife trade. The directive achieved at least one thing, which is that all of our member states have criminalized wildlife trafficking. We require in this directive that member states set up sanctions, criminal sanctions in their codes of criminal codes. But the sanctions are not regulated in detail, neither the type nor the volume, because at the time when this directive was adopted, the case law of the Court of Justice would not allow that we regulate the sanctions in detail. So we have the generic requirement in the directive, which is that member states must introduce effective, proportionate and dissuasive sanctions, which must include certain sanctions for natural persons and for legal persons as well. So both are concerned. Natural persons should be subject to sanctions of deprivation of liberty and fines, but there are no details. Whereas for legal persons, there is a provision on vicarious liability. So the types of behavior that can engage the liability of a legal person. But there are no details about the sanctions applicable to legal persons either. Now, we have evaluated this directive in 2020, so 2 years ago, almost 2 years ago. And the conclusion was that the mere existence of the directive is useful. It creates a level playing field among the member states. But we noted with regrets, we noted with regrets that there are large differences which remain in the sanctioning systems among the member states. There are member states which introduced very harsh sanctions, years of imprisonment in some member states, whereas for the same offense, other member states introduced financial sanctions only. So there is no level playing field. There is no equivalence in terms of sanctioning among the member states. And we noted the same thing vis-à-vis legal persons. Legal persons are not subject to the same type of liability. In some member states, criminal liability is possible and even required, whereas in other member states, administrative liability is the main type of liability. And as you know, this does not carry the same moral stigma which criminal liability would. But apart from all this, the main problem that we detected with the directive is that it's not working in practice. As any directive, it needs to be transposed into domestic legislation and then implemented in practice, which means operated in the daily business of police, law enforcement, and judiciary, with the necessary resources, money, people trained and qualified. In many of our member states, there is a problem with the practical implementation. There's a problem with the training. There's a problem with the resources dedicated to this area. In short, we see a problem with prioritization of this type of crime. And Katalin, in her introduction, actually put her finger on these problems. This is not a priority in most of our member states. This is not prosecuted in practice in most of our member states. This is actually on the bottom of the list for most of our member states because pressure from society, from the government, from politicians is not such that this should be higher on the priority list for prosecution. So the objective should be indeed to draw attention to this and make it a priority and dedicate resources to it. That is certainly the intention of the Commission with the revision of the directive. We have announced this in the Commission work program for 2022. So a directive is due to be presented at the end of this year. The directive will address the shortcomings of the current version. We will beef up the scope of the directive. We will look at how the annexes are currently being updated or not, rather in practice, and how could we avoid having annexes, and actually we should define the offenses better in the directive itself. So this is what we're looking at now. The second thing which we're looking at is the sanctions. So we will certainly go into detail about the types and volume of sanctions that we require for the 9 categories of the offenses. There could be more in the future because there are some issues which are missing from the directive. So we will update also the scope of the directive. And we will see the relationship between administrative sanctions and criminal sanctions, which is really the crux of the matter. We need to make sure that the same type of sanctions apply more or less throughout the European Union to this kind of crime category. And then all the issues that Katalin mentioned, for example, intra-agency cooperation within the member states. We need to make sure that member states have a clear strategy with the agencies, inspection agencies, law enforcement agencies, and then judicial authorities cooperating one with the other, so that the chain is complete and the cases arrive to the judiciary. Number two, we need to make sure that people are trained, that they are dedicated, and there are resources in this area. And in the same way, we need to make sure that all this is happening at the European Union on a cross-border level, so that cooperation happens vis-à-vis Europol, vis-à-vis Olaf, vis-à-vis Eurojust, so that cross-border cooperation becomes indeed a priority for national authorities, and that the cross-border aspect is not ignored, as it is very often nowadays. If you look at the statistics of Eurojust, it's about 1% of the casework of Eurojust, 1% out of the 30 serious crime categories that they are dealing with, whereas this is the number 4 most lucrative crime type in the world. And wildlife trafficking in particular is lucrative because organized crime is involved. So we need to make sure that these crimes are prosecuted, there are convictions happening, and that the proceeds of crime, which are generated by this crime category, are forfeited and confiscated by judicial authorities. So there will be provisions in the revised directive on this one as well. And last but not least, we will add some provisions on training the position of victims to represent the environment, so to act on behalf of the environment in criminal trials. So there will be some accessory provisions, and we will introduce, of course, provisions to reinstate the environment as well for natural and for legal persons. So this is in a nutshell what we are planning to do. As you have guessed, this is part of a bigger plan. It's part of the Commission's drive to better protect the environment, of the European Green Deal, etc. So criminal law should come as the ultimate enforcement weapon. There will be many other actions as well, including by my colleagues in DG Environment, who will work on the wildlife trafficking enforcement plan. There's a compliance forum, and there will be guidance notes, etc. Criminal law should remain the last resort, but it has to be there, and it has to be effective. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ksonka. And the last point of your intervention, of course, made an excellent bridge for our next speaker. But before we proceed, I would like to take the moment to thank you very much for your speech, presenting us with some further updates on the forthcoming revision of the Environmental Crime Directive, but also for highlighting the vision of the European Commission and the high level of ambition, at the same time touching upon the implementation part, which is an extremely important point as well. So thank you very much for your remarks. Our speaker to follow is Mr. Matthias Leonhard Meyer, Team Leader for CITES and Wildlife Trade Regulation. Mr. Meyer is a political scientist by training and has worked at research institutes in various countries before joining the European Commission back in 2010. Since then, he has worked on fisheries, agriculture, and environmental issues in the EU and globally, with a particular focus on biodiversity. Without further ado, Mr. Meyer, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to be here. Thanks to Ms. Evi for hosting the event, and to our capable moderators. So I have been invited to speak about the Wildlife Action Plan that has already been referenced numerous times today, and in particular its evaluation. Perhaps I should start by briefly recalling what's in the plan and what its nature is. Presumably most of you are more or less familiar with it, but the document dates from 2016, so maybe it's not very fresh on everyone's memory. So the action plan is organized around 3 main policy priorities. The first of which is prevention, so basically the intention to go to the roots of the problem through activities such as awareness raising, reducing the demand for illegally traded wildlife, as well as its supply. And in that context, it was quite important also when the plan was adopted to engage with the business community. The second priority, and Katalin, I think it was who already alluded to this, is implementation and enforcement of the existing rules and regulations around wildlife trade. And the aim there was not least to move towards a more strategic approach to enforcement activities, to checking whether the trade that takes place is within the limits of the law. But just as important, capacity building, of course, in terms of law enforcement, not least. And there was a particular focus also on organized crime in this context. The third main priority of the action plan is building of global partnerships, because obviously with activity such as illegal wildlife trade, there is only so much that can be done within the EU boundaries. And hence, the plan foresaw directing development assistance to countries and regions specifically for the purpose of fighting wildlife trafficking, also to strengthen bilateral cooperation, and of course to work through the relevant multilateral fora, such as CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, and other relevant fora. So all this was written into a Commission communication. So that's also important to keep in mind, that we are talking about a policy document that is not legally binding, unlike the Environmental Crime Directive. It does benefit, however, or has benefited from the political endorsement both by the European Parliament and by the EU Council. It does not have a dedicated implementation structure as such. It rather relies, the action plan for its implementation, on joint action by, first of all, the EU member states, of course, who have competence for law enforcement across the Union. Then the Commission through the relevant departments, two of which are here today on this panel, but also other actors in the Union, such as the External Action Service, Europol, Eurojust, and other networks of practitioners. And last but not least, there are also several relevant international bodies that have been assigned in the that have been given a role, so to speak, in the implementation of the action plan. Interpol obviously is relevant here, but also, for example, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, and several others. Now, as has also already been mentioned, the action plan formally reached the end of its foreseen lifetime at the end of last year. And that is why we are now in the process of evaluating how well it has served the purpose. This evaluation is part of the standard toolbox, if you want, that we have in the Commission for continuously improving our policies. And it follows a relatively standardized process, looking into criteria such as effectiveness, efficiency. Relevance is what we wrote in 2016, still, are those still the most important issues today? Coherence is also another evaluation criterion in terms of how these policies interact with others. And here, of course, the Crime Directive is obviously relevant, but there are also several others, even beyond the environmental domain. A key step has now been made in the evaluation process with the launching of this public consultation. And towards the end of my intervention, I will try and show the the website where this consultation can be accessed. So this is also something that we do in the Commission basically all the time when we evaluate policies, that we give the chance to everyone in the public, be it individual citizens or stakeholder organizations or businesses, to express their views and respond to a certain number of questions that will then be analyzed by a group of consultants that we have hired for the purpose, and which will form the basis for our actual evaluation document, a so-called Commission staff working document for the insiders. This is the form that the evaluation will take at the end. In addition to the evaluation, and it's half separate, half combined, is the revision of the action plan, so the writing of a new plan basically for the next time period, which indeed is a commitment that the new Commission made in the biodiversity strategy already last year. This is a little bit untypical maybe, in the sense that if we had done the evaluation by the books, we would have waited until it's completed before making up our mind as to what should come afterwards, or indeed if anything else should come afterwards. But here we have a clear political commitment that there should again be some such action plan to replace the current one. But of course, what will be in the new plan, that very much depends still on the outcome of the evaluation. So if you look at the actual questionnaire for the online consultation, you will see that it includes both, let's say, more classical evaluation type of questions that look backwards in time and that ask for people's assessment of how different parts of the plan have been more or less successful, and what might explain this success or its absence. But it also has questions of a more forward-looking nature, with a view to identifying current priorities and perhaps recalibrating to some extent the measures for the new action plan. Maybe this is a good moment, actually, if I may ask the host to allow me to share the screen so that I can show the website with the consultation. Or is that enabled already? Should I just try?
It is indeed already enabled.
Okay, thanks. So you should be able to see that now. It's a relatively lengthy, complicated address, but you can also just go to the main Commission webpage and search for "Have Your Say" and wildlife trafficking, and then you will also hopefully land on this page. And there are actually two things here, and this has been the source of some confusion, I'm afraid. There is a so-called roadmap, which is another part of the policy cycle in the Commission, whereby we announce a forthcoming initiative, and in this case, it's indeed the revision of the action plan. And this roadmap is also open for it should be open actually for consultation. And this is where the confusion comes from, because there was already, and I have made the mistake myself, apparently, already last year we published a roadmap on for the evaluation of the action plan. That one is closed by now. But if, unlike me, you go to the right page, then you will see here a roadmap for the revision, which is still open. Comments are invited, I believe, until beginning of November. But the more important and also much more elaborate part of this consultation is the one that is labeled here public consultation, and which runs until the end of the year, and which asks all those questions to which I referred. So that's just in terms of how things are organized. I will stop sharing that now. And perhaps we can, in follow-up to the event, also send around the link directly to the participants. Let me finish by just briefly highlighting what we have already identified as some of the challenges in the process of evaluating and revising the action plan. Of course, it's never easy to identify and measure the success of one single policy, especially if you don't necessarily have a clear baseline against which to compare that policy. So we live in the world where the action plan has been there the last 4 years, and we have no way of knowing what would have happened in its absence. There are some tools, of course, for trying to overcome this challenge, and we will try and make use of those, but that remains a not so straightforward part of the exercise. Another thing that has also been highlighted, I believe it was Ms. Evi in her opening speech, is about finding the necessary resources to make such a policy work. When the 2016 action plan was adopted, it did not come with any dedicated funds. It was the bet, so to speak, was that by raising attention also at political level, at least some funds would start to flow, or would increase flowing from sources that have been there for some time, such as development assistance, such as the LIFE program, from which SWIPE is benefiting. So maybe it wasn't entirely useless in that respect, although relevant projects have been running under LIFE also already before, I would guess. And then maybe just to finish off, we are also very much aware of the increasingly high expectations that are directed at such a relatively modest instrument about which we're talking here. Also, the expectations, I think it's quite obvious that they're partly conflicting. We are talking not only about nature conservation, but we are increasingly also talking about things like public health, animal welfare, and so on. And it's not always the case, unfortunately, that these objectives all point in the same direction. And if you combine this with the still very uncertain prospects in terms of the resources that can be mobilized, then I think the challenge is there for everyone to see. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the rest of the presentations and the discussion later on.
Thank you very much, Mr. Meyer, for your holistic presentation, but also for providing us with the rationale with regards to the European Commission's approach. Thank you also for highlighting the ongoing consultation put in place. Unfortunately, at least on our end, on behalf of the Secretariat of your intergroup, your screen was not visible during the last minutes of your intervention. But if you could communicate with us the relevant link, we can also make sure to share it live during the event with our audience. On this note, I'm happy to present our next speaker, Lieutenant Colonel Mr. Christian Tournet, who is deputy to the head of the Central Office for Fight Against Environmental and Public Health Crime, in charge of the European and International Affairs at the French Gendarmerie. Mr. Tournier has contributed to defining policies and strategies in criminal matters, notably related to environment and public health crimes as far as financial and cybercrime investigations. Mr. Tournier, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Firstly, I would like to give this opportunity to take the floor, to thank particularly European Parliament Intergroup on climate change and biodiversity and sustainable development, and all actors, particularly as well, to congratulate and thanks all who are committed with this project. This project is fully in line with the implementation of policy cycle impact on environmental crime, and impact was discussed, then agreed in full knowledge on what there were already implemented with the EU Action Plan against wildlife trafficking. I want to say it's a clear synergy between different initiatives at the EU levels, initiative depending on the angle we try to progress to prevent and to deter wildlife trafficking with all relevant actors, stakeholders. It's an opportunity to say it's of course responsibility of the public authorities, but as well of civil society. And it's great to work with NGOs. I have a lot of them in mind, and this kind of project is typically how we can progress closely. Speaking about impact, we have a clear link between impact and the EU Action Plan against wildlife trafficking. Firstly, to keep in mind, it was political decision in Brussels at the Council with all EU institutions to say we should progress. We progress, of course, to fight against environmental crime, and speaking about the priority on environmental crime impact policy cycle on organized international crime. It was agreed at the Council in May 2017 to prioritize wildlife trafficking and waste trafficking, particularly. What means it was wildlife trafficking, it was at the top of the priority in the field of justice and home affair fights. When I speak about synergy dynamic, it was concrete action along with the implementation of impact. The 4 years, just to say, it's not fully closed, but of course was at the end, was in the process to close step by step the operation action. What we would like to underline is some issues, some what already developed by previously. Firstly, to progress, we should reinforce criminal measures. It was developed by Mr. Peter Zonka as a driver of impact on environmental crime, and with a colleague, we organize a lot of meetings, operational activities. We visit on site different states, different administration, means speaking about law enforcement agencies, representative of inspection, of police, of custom, and so on and so on. And what we face is lack of course, clear domestic legislation to, what do you say, to permit to have a clear investigation in transborder investigation with Europol, with the Eurojust. Someone speak about that Olaf. Frontex is another one who will be well committed with impact on environmental crime. Firstly, it was political decision, clear mission for all of us. How we progress and what we learn. We learned firstly, it's important to reinforce capacity. What means concretely? It means firstly to identify at domestic level who is in charge to investigate? Who is empowered for judicial investigation, particularly when we speak about criminal networks, when it's important to use dedicated investigative tools, particularly related to financial investigation, because we investigate in economic sectors. We speak about money laundering. We have in mind from the beginning of the penal process to seize assets. Cyber investigation, the cyber wildlife project was very relevant, and with impact, it was joint action for what we share our experiences. It was not the same. The addition, it's a real added value. It's of course to advocate, to support states, to specialize investigators, judges and prosecutors. As well, it's to say it's important to have national contact point with relevant specialized investigators with a support or relevant advisor from the different ministry of agriculture, environment at regional and national levels. Training and speaking, because the time is flying, what we learn? We learn we can reinforce bridge between all relevant authorities in a transverse and multidisciplinary capacity. It means as well to adapt sometimes the legal framework, to disclose some information, to build some guidelines, best practices, and so on and so on. Speaking about operational outcomes, I can say step by step, along we, of course, slowly could be, but we implement some operational activities to deter criminal network. I cannot disclose information which are under investigation, but of course it will be developed maybe later on by some colleagues. We progress trafficking of birds, transit between Africa and Asia by the EU, trafficking of glass seed, and so on and so on. For which, beyond, we have real criminals which invest a lot of money. You know, low risk, high profile. It's exactly the case. Okay, I will not back about distortion of definition at domestic level, disparity between kind and level of sanction. It's clear in my perspective, having traveled around the world, around the EU on this issue, we should progress when we say the proportional, dissuasive, and effective measure. Speaking about training, training was not only for investigators, prosecutors, judges, but as well, depending on the aim of the training, actors of the civil society. What we can expect for the future, before to say what we expect, it's already to say it's a great news for us, is during the last springtime in Brussels, the Council agreed continuity of the implementation of impact on environmental crime. What means? It means it's collectively, including the implementation of EU Action Plan against wildlife trafficking, impact, wide initiative in complementary approach, we can say we were successful and received green light to continue. We received as well great support for European Commission with funding. We can speak funding by DG Environment, by DG Home, and so on and so on. I can speak about the current internal security funding ambitious, where we have more or less 12 member states, EU agencies, and so on, to implement what I just developed with money, because we need, of course, money, and we will develop as well, as I said, some guidelines. It's in my capacity great, and something what already said by the previous speaker is based on the will of your member state. I can say about France, because I was member of the French delegation. We progress at the UNODC in Vienna at the UNODC in charge of criminal problems, with resolution on environmental crime on the umbrella of Palermo Convention. It means the Convention on Organized Crime. We have a clear, at the global levels, a clear feuille de route, roadmap for 4 years, based on the Declaration of Kyoto Congress, we are going to implement. And wildlife trafficking is at the heart of the priority to deter, prevent, and fight against environmental crime. I'm so sorry, time is flying. Thanks a lot, and I will be pleased to continue to work with all of you and colleagues from including, of course, from everywhere, all kinds of organizations. I'm so sorry I should leave, but my collaborator will stay, and it could be, if necessary, to call me if I should react. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tournier, for your intervention and also for sharing with us some practical lessons learned. I just noticed that we're running almost 15 minutes late with regards to today's agenda, so I would like to kindly ask our speakers to be cautious of timekeeping in order to ensure a fruitful discussion with our audience to follow. And on this note, I would also like to echo the message of my colleague Regine placed in the chat box. So I would like to kindly remind our audience to send us your questions during the event. And for this purpose, you can use the Q&As box of the platform, choosing the all panelists option. Within your message, if you could also indicate the speaker to whom your question is best addressed, that would be great so that we can ensure a fruitful discussion to follow later in the event. On this note, I'm happy to introduce our next speaker, Ms. Beate Stribel, on behalf of WWF. So Ms. Stribel is the Network Sturgeon Strategy Coordinator at WWF and has been working in WWF in various roles for the last 20 years, focusing on species conservation, and she's also co-author of the Pan-European Action Plan for the conservation of sturgeon. So Ms. Stribel, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. Ms. Stribel, can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay,
Thank you.
perfect.
Can you see my screen?
Not yet.
Yet, okay.
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you very much.
Okay. Okay, thanks a lot. I would like to provide now a very specific case example on sturgeon trafficking and how that evidence that we've collected in a new funded project links to the EU action plan under discussion. To understand the urgency, sturgeons are the most threatened species group on this planet, and particularly in Europe, the situation looks very dire. From 8 existing species, 7 are critically endangered and face extinction. 1 species might actually already be lost for EU territory. The reason for that is definitely historical overfishing in the past that might have been legal but was certainly not sustainable. And single cases on poaching and illegal trade have reached us, but they have not been systematically collected until recently. And that was one reason why WWF entered in a live funded project with different partners and conducted a market survey and a compilation of existing authority data on seizures on sturgeon in the lower Danube countries that all share the same populations of migratory sturgeon species. And these countries are Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, and Ukraine. The market survey was supported by 2 forensic laboratories from Germany. The authority data that we were able to analyze included mostly incidents on illegal fishing and the seizure of illegal fishing gear. Altogether, that data mainly came from fishing authorities and from police branches. So 214 cases were analyzed. The variety of data in these cases was hard to compare. So we only speak of minimum numbers that we achieved, but alone in Bulgaria, we found almost 600 pieces of illegal sturgeon hook lines, and that already speaks about the dimension of the problem. The cases that had specimens attached or collected were amounting to at least 600 specimens that were affected by these different cases. The numbers of the authorities were increasing over the years that we've collected them. That may be linked to more efforts of the authorities, but since we have no information on these efforts, that remains to be seen. In addition to those available data from authorities, we have conducted in an undercover approach. We have collected 145 sturgeon meat and caviar samples and analyzed them forensically with the laboratories in Germany. We've collected them throughout the whole supply chain, so from markets, open markets, shops, restaurants, street vendors, but also online trade. We found that 30% of all samples collected were sold illegally. This is quite a high amount. And most worryingly, 27 samples have been proven to come from wild-caught sturgeon. And this is, of course, what we've been trying to find. We also found violations against CITES regulations with caviar samples, and we found several wrong declarations that could be attributed to consumer deceit or fraud. Most notably, this survey applied a first forensic methods to identify sturgeon products, whether they come from the wild or from an aquaculture source. So that already provides an evidence whether it is legal or illegal. And most notably, I think this was the first regional scale compilation of the issue that can bring a light to the impact of shared populations, because you always have to look on the whole range of the species. And then the study, of course, concludes and has many more details than I just presented now. It concludes with a lot of recommendations, what could be done to improve the situation. And many of these actually overlap with the actions that are currently in the action plan that we are discussing. And they start with tackling the root causes. And one of the most important aspects is actually the rural communities that should ideally be engaged and also benefit from wildlife conservation. The rural fishing communities in the lower Danube of the sturgeon rain countries certainly have not seen much benefit so far, because they have only been confronted with fishing bans that put a stop to their former economic activities. So there is much room for improvement on this aspect. Also, the role of a business sector is important. Sturgeon aquaculture facilities must comply with CITES regulations, and they should also increase their efforts to exclude any potential laundering of wild products through their supply chains. On the priority 2 of the action plan, stepping up the implementation of existing rules, I'd like to note 2 actions that are very relevant: improving the detection rate. So I think our report has now provided a first baseline for future work and also for risk-based enforcement actions. But it is important to stress that we always have to look along the whole trade chain and not singly at just one spot. So it does go from the actual fishing on site through aquaculture to the demand side. And on action 12, which says assessing the enforcement of priorities regularly, I would hope that our report makes a good statement that sturgeon, which are highly threatened, can be included as future target species for the countries that are range states for these migratory fish. Interagency and cross-country cooperation has been raised by several of the speakers before, and I cannot stress enough how important that was. It is linked in the action plan, the current action plan, with many actions, and actually the lack of interagency cooperation on a national level was identified as a main shortcoming. Interagency cooperation in terms of, specifically for sturgeon, means different police branches, locally, regional, international, national ones, the fishing authorities, food and sanitary inspections, and have to control the restaurants, customs, CITES authorities, and not even to speak about the whole judiciary state chain. And only if all these actors come together and regularly start putting their data and their information together, we can efficiently tackle the problem. And as a last point, for migratory sturgeon populations that cross borders regularly and often in their life cycle, cross-border cooperation is key. Not only sharing intelligence and conducting common controls, this is relevant for trade-related aspects, but it is also very relevant to include this for enforcement actions against illegal fishing or poaching. So to conclude, I want to make the point that wildlife crime is happening within EU borders, and it's happening across EU borders, and it does threaten wildlife of community interest. And in order to assess and tackle the impact of this wildlife crime on migratory population, we need a much better cooperation of the range countries, again, within EU and non-EU. Thanks a lot. I included some links for further reading in my last slide. Thanks a lot for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Beate, for your presentation, highlighting us the evidence for sturgeon trafficking and also the links to the EU action plan against wildlife trafficking. I'm also very thankful for the increased number of questions received by our audience, so very much looking forward to the Q&As part. Before that, it is with pleasure to introduce our next speaker to follow, and specifically Ms. van der Henst, who will be presenting us on successes and lessons learned from the implementation of the EU Action Plan against wildlife trafficking. So Ms. Emily van der Henst is project manager at Traffic and has been coordinating the EU Wildlife Cybercrime project for the last 2.5 years. Before that, Emily worked at the WWF, European Policy Officer, for nearly 10 years, where she coordinated advocacy actions towards EU institutions related to the fight against wildlife trafficking, among other sustainable development matters. So Emily, it's with pleasure to have you with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Ilias. Regine, I'm afraid you will have to share my PowerPoint because finally the plan didn't really work out of how I wanted to do it. So just sorry for this to the audience.
No problem.
You can stretch your legs before my presentation. It was quite a long session of presentations, and yeah, okay, thank you. So, okay. So thanks a lot, and good afternoon, everyone. So I will be speaking on behalf of Traffic, and I will highlight some of the key successes and lessons learned from the implementation of the EU Action Plan against wildlife trafficking. And I will speak more specifically from my experience as manager of the EU Wildlife Cybercrime project. This is a project which ended in June this year, which was financed by DG Home Affairs under its Internal Security Fund. And the aim of the project was to disrupt criminals and criminal networks trafficking wildlife in Europe and via the European Union using the internet and parcel delivery services. And the project was led by WWF and Traffic and implemented in partnership with Interpol, the Belgian Customs and IFO. Europol also provided quite a lot of support to the project. So just a note before I start my presentation is that when I speak about wildlife trafficking, I take it in the broad sense. So I'm talking about animals, plants, timber, and fisheries trafficking. So next slide, please. So the first success that we could witness was an increased the fact that the EU Wildlife Trafficking Action Plan helped really putting the fight against wildlife trafficking higher up on the political agenda. It was an ambitious plan endorsed by the Parliament and the Council, and it did trigger increased political and law enforcement attention on the topic. And we believe that the plan was instrumental in getting wildlife trafficking and more broadly environmental crime as one of the EU priority on the fight against organized crime under the so-called impact process that Colonel Tournier presented before. And it really helped making the issue of wildlife trafficking more than just a conservation issue, to be really treated as an issue linked to serious and organized crime. Yet, for the future plan, we believe that there is still room for sustained efforts. And as Mr. Xonka said it, there is still not enough prioritization for wildlife trafficking, wildlife crime matters in general. This was also expressed at our multi-stakeholder conference that we organized in May under the Wildlife Cybercrime Project. Several law enforcers actually voiced their concerns and saying that there is a lack of prioritization of wildlife crime within their own agencies. So in order to demonstrate a real political will, what would be important in the next EU action plan is that it's really backed up by a dedicated budget, both at EU level, but also at member states level. And that budget to really be identified and being here mobilized to implement concretely the plan, because currently there is still really a lack of human resources and technical resources all over, like in member states, but also within the EU institutions, in the European Commission and in Europol. Next slide, please. My second point relates to the law enforcement operations. So the plan and the impact and the crime really translated into concrete law enforcement operations across Europe and internationally, and that's extremely important, obviously. So if I talk about the EU Wildlife Cybercrime Project, it supported 2 law enforcement operations, one under the impact, so it was an operational action on wildlife cybercrime, and the result, so it was led by the Irish police and involved 80 EU member states. And the result of that was that there were 121 suspicious websites identified, 80 regulatory infringements identified, and 80 criminal infringements. It also supported the Thunder 2020 operation, which is an operation coordinated by Interpol and the World Customs Organization. And for the first time in the Thunder operations in 2020, there was a cyber-enabled wildlife crime component in it. On the slide, you can see the overall outcome of the operation, but if I take the figures just of the cyber component, there were 145 cyber investigations performed, which led to 58 criminal penalties, nearly 1,200 units of illegal wildlife seized, and 40 suspects identified. And for the future plan, we think it would be important to establish measurable law enforcement operation targets, both at national and EU level. So because some EU member states still need to demonstrate further commitment and action, member states with law enforcement efforts are used by traffickers as safe hubs to smuggle wildlife, and then that can enter into the EU single market. So the member states really should commit to translating the plan at national level, translating the EU plan at national level. And for example, they could set a target number of operations annually at national level so that then those member states can be held accountable. And in this respect, more generally, it would be important to have a strong and comprehensive monitoring and evaluation system, so to support the EU action plan in order to measure progress and ensure accountability towards its implementation. Next slide, please. So briefly about training and specialization, because this has been mentioned previously several times by speakers. The current EU action plan has enabled the development of trainings, definitely, in particular for law enforcement agencies. But those trainings are really essential, as CITES and the EU wildlife trade regulations are really not easy to apprehend, especially for frontline officers who have like really dozens of criminal problems to deal with, and also the fact that wildlife traffickers are constantly changing smuggling techniques to avoid detection. So you constantly need to update your knowledge on the wildlife crime phenomenon. Through the cybercrime project, for example, we trained hundreds of officials from CITES, management authorities, police, customs on tackling wildlife cybercrime. And we have helped also deepening the understanding of wildlife trafficking online and through parcels, thanks to several reports and tools such as a database of code words for cyber patrolling. And for the future plan, definitely, training, specialization needs to continue for the law enforcement chain, for the judiciary chain, for the private sector as well. Next slide, please. So one point about financial investigation and asset recovery. And here it's not really a success of the current plan, it's rather a gap. We believe that the next EU action plan should really encourage a more systematic use of financial investigations and asset recovery procedures in the field of wildlife crime. So those so-called follow the money approaches, they really help in identifying and dismantling the wider criminal networks, and especially the network's leaders and financiers behind wildlife trafficking. And recovering the assets of those organized crime networks really significantly weakens them. And at the moment, financial investigations are really largely underutilized in general, and especially in the field of wildlife trafficking. So the result of that is that low-level criminals like poachers are caught and prosecuted, and actually the more senior members of the criminal networks, which are the ones benefiting most from the crime, they are just free to continue their activities. So in this respect, there is currently a revision of the EU directive on the freezing and confiscation of the proceeds of crime, and we really hope that this revision will help in ensuring a more systematic use of financial investigation in the field of environmental crime. Next slide, please. Coordination and collaboration, it has been mentioned by my colleague Beate before, so definitely I want to stress it again, multidisciplinary and multi-stakeholder approaches are essential, and they need to be further formalized and scaled up in the next plan. The cybercrime project was a good example of collaboration between law enforcers and NGOs, and it really proves to be fruitful to bring different competencies around the table and towards achieving a common goal. Next slide, please. One point about the mobilization of the private sector. So the private sector, such as, for example, online and transport companies, are used by wildlife traffickers. And those companies unwittingly become a link in the illegal wildlife trade chain. So there has been progress really on the mobilization of the private sector to get them to also do their share in fighting wildlife trafficking. And some of those progress can be attributed to the EU action plan. So for example, through the cybercrime project, we rolled out the coalition to end wildlife trafficking online. This coalition gathers large online technology companies, online platforms, e-commerce companies to have an industry-wide approach to really try to make sure that those platforms are free from illegal wildlife content. And through the cybercrime project, 9 European-based platforms committed to take concrete measures for making sure they were not facilitating wildlife trafficking. But for the future plan, we believe that it's really important to further mobilize the private sector, and because actually through the cybercrime project, we saw that not all companies approached were really eager to take additional steps in addressing wildlife trafficking. So some did not see the relevance of the subject to them, and that was the case for some companies in the courier and postal sector. Or some online platforms were suggesting that they are already meeting the legal requirements, and they were not interested in taking voluntary additional measures. So, and that was the case, for example, for some specialized online platforms selling exotic pets. That's why we believe that, especially for online trade, we need a clear legislative framework. Which sets the conditions under which we can sell, advertise, and purchase wildlife online. And in this respect, we hope that the Digital Service Act package, which is currently examined by the European Parliament and the EU Council, will provide a legislative answer to ensuring that online platforms are more accountable. Next slide, please. That's my final point. It relates to awareness raising and behavior change. So actually, it was the first action of the EU Action Plan against wildlife trafficking. The action was to increase support to awareness raising and targeted demand reduction campaigns in the EU and worldwide. But we believe that there was little progress on that front in the EU. So it would be important to have such initiatives in order to complement the law enforcement efforts. And here we distinguish between general awareness raising and behavior change initiatives. So there are two different types of actions. They are both necessary. For the behavior change initiatives, we need to really target specific consumers of commodities, especially those commodities for which the EU is a globally important market. So that's, for example, the exotic reptiles, live reptiles as in the pet trade, amphibians, but also timber. And for the awareness raising part, it's really important that citizens are more aware of the EU wildlife trade rules, because currently the level of knowledge is extremely low, and are more aware also on the seriousness of wildlife crime. So, for example, through the Coalition to End Wildlife Trafficking Online, we try to use to get online platforms to do user education. So, for example, Instagram had pop-ups alerts to raise awareness on wildlife trafficking to their users, but really further steps need to be done, and in Europe especially. On the awareness raising bit, I think it's also important that law enforcers in general at large and the judiciary chain is also made much more aware of the wildlife trafficking phenomenon. And I would like to mention the fact that the EU Crime Prevention Network, EU-CPN, will actually soon launch a campaign targeted to law enforcers to raise their awareness on the wildlife trafficking phenomenon, which was supported by the EU Wildlife Cybercrime Project. Next slide, please. So I came to the end of my presentation, and thank you all for your attention.
Thank you very much, Emily, for your insightful presentation, for sharing with us some successes and lessons learned, but also for your concrete policy recommendations with regards to the new plan. Our next speaker to follow is Mr. Miguel Godoy, who is the mayor of the Guardia Civil, a public security corps of national scope that is part of the state security forces and bodies of Spain. Mr. Godoy has been part of the Guardia Civil for 25 years now, where he has performed various functions, among which Major of the Department of Economic Crimes of the Technical Unit for the Judicial Police. Mr. Godoy, the floor is yours. Thank you for being with us.
Can you hear me?
Yes, very well, thank you.
Yeah, okay. So sorry, I'm trying to share my screen. Yes. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, this is perfect.
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you so much for your kind invitation to take part in this event. Well, for us, it's a big pleasure to take part in this interesting discussion. And I have to say that almost everything is already said. This is something that happens when you are the last one in take the floor. But my intention is not to innovate, but also to provide our experience in this regard. I know that we are out of the time, and I will try to the point. This is the summary of my presentation, and I will go step by step very quickly in each one. And first of all, I would like to stress the idea that Spain, I think that was maybe the first country in made the translation into the national program of the EU Action Plan. So it took around 2 years, and this is the acronym that I am going to use during my presentation. The TFIES is the National action plan regarding wildlife trafficking. And from the very beginning of the draft of this new plan, Guardia Civil was present together with other part of different ministries. And well, thanks to the offer made by the Ministry of Environment at that moment, and nowadays the Ministry of Ecological Transition. And in this regard, I would like to stress that we have been taking part in the 3 pillars, more or less, in the 3 pillars that Mr. Mailer told before. But mainly, our main goal was focused in the criminals or criminal organized in the organized crime related to wildlife trafficking, and we have been developed several activities in close contact with the ministry. So in this regard, this is a clear example of mutual collaboration between both institutions. We have been speaking a lot about the necessity to reinforce the coordination between different departments, and this is a clear example that we can share with us, with all of you, regarding the interaction between these 2 ministries. On the other side, I would like to let you know some topics that in order to go into the concrete action that we have implemented together between the TFIES and Guardia Civil. From one side, TFIES provide our units technical support during the investigations. They also support our activities in the management of the specimen when we seizure the animals in the operation. They also provide some kind of equipment and specialized equipment to our units, and also facilitate analysis in order to provide technical report to the judicial at the judicial level. All of this is in the context of several trainings and continuous training of our agents that it is provided by the ministry together with Guardia Civil, because we also provide with our expertise in order to train our agents in this regard. On the other side, our contribution to this synergy, we develop more operation and we provide more quality in our operations. We also report the outcomes to the ministry in order to realize that this investment is really efficient. And as I told you before, we also support the training course organized by the ministry, and we request the operational needs at the same time that we are conducting our operations. And in some figures from the beginning of the implementation of the TFIES in Spain, you can see more or less this is the general overview of what the ministry has provided to our operations. This number of technical reports. There is something very, very important. What is the management of the specimens once we are seized? We seize in the operation, because neither law enforcement nor the judicial authorities sometimes we don't know how to manage what we can do with this specimen. This is something very, very important. They are in the position to manage this. You can see more than 4,000 specimens has been managed by the ministry in our operations. They also provide us with the identification of DNA analysis in our operation. In this case, in reptiles, but also in other specimens. Some more important issues regarding the analysis of ivory with the techniques of carbon-14 in order to detect the time of this ivory. And also in the field of timber trafficking, well, we have been working in a very important tool to detect and to be able to analyze quickly the timber that we seize, and also what they provide training to our agents. In total, we from the beginning we have carried out 24 training courses in different areas, and we have had more than 500 agents attending to this training course. Also in general figures, our contribution from Guardia Civil from the beginning of TFIES, you can see almost 1,000 minor offenses reported to the competent authorities by Guardia Civil, 224 crimes detected, and more than 300 criminals have been arrested in this context. So this is something that what we can show how it works. Really, it is really efficient, our common job. And here you can see some more figures regarding training, and you can see how it increased the number of operations when we started with the training course with our agents. This is the number of people that we have trained in this training course, and you can make the the link between the training and the specialization of our agents with the outcomes in terms of operations. So this is something that most of the previous speakers have said, and here you can see the figure that it is in fact something really important. Regarding our contribution in criminal cases to Europol, you can see also from the beginning of the analysis project MEP Crime in Europol in 2017. And when we started working together with the ministry, you can see the figure of this is the cases that we have reported to Europol. These are concrete cases in which a criminal organization has been prosecuted by Guardia Civil, and you can see the line that is increasingly from the beginning. On the other side, there are a lot of complementary initiatives that it is necessary to carry out in order to focus the attention in criminal investigation, that it is the core of our activities, but also at international level, it is important to align all the activity throughout the whole chain. So we are working at MEP CrimeNet. We also share the network MEP CrimeNet until the end of next year, and we work very closely with the IMPEL in terms of inspector, MP, prosecutor, and also the forum of judges. That is absolutely necessary to align all the activities in order to go all together in the same sense. Other relevant actors in the field of wildlife, of course, is the Latin American region. As you know very well, there are origin of many illicit traffic of wildlife, and in this regard, we also are working in the Jaguar network with 5 countries of Europe and 8 countries of Latin America. It is called the Jaguar network, also created in the framework of MPAC MEP Crime. But it is very interesting to go ahead in this regard. Well, MPAC MEP Crime is already said. We are now in the process to establish the new guidelines for the next MPAC 2022 plus. For the next cycle, we will be co-driver of the MPAC and driver of in the 2 last years of the cycle. And we have to thank the experience and the lesson learned from our colleagues from France that have carried out a very interesting first cycle in the MPAC MEP Crime. Regarding other initiatives at a strategic level, we are working also with the DG ENVI in a program that is called Life Plus Attack in the field of provide advisory from the criminal investigation point of view to the European institution in terms of the revision, for example, of the European Crime Directive that has already mentioned by Mr. Sanska. Well, and we also collaborate and work very closely with Europol and Interpol in the field of operations. Just to finish at national level, we see the action plan that we need to reinforce the interaction between both ministries. It is because the outcomes are really good, and we need to reinforce our capacities, but we need to go a bit further. Nowadays, we are working for example, in a protocol to aware the judges about how to manage the specimen sales when we are working in the operation. So there are a big room for the improvement in this regard, and we need to go ahead in this sense. At international level, from Sebrona, we will provide support at several initiatives at EU level, as I have mentioned before. In Latin America, we need to reinforce our interaction with them. And well, for the next EU action plan, we consider very, very relevant, taking into account our experience in this year, that we need to reinforce the link between competent authorities in terms of DGMB, of the European Commission, for example, and the criminal investigation agencies at this level, not only at European level, but also within the whole member states. So it means that more implication of Europol and the criminal investigation agencies throughout the European Union, I think it could be a key point to succeed in the next cycle. And also, as previous speaker mentioned, it is necessary to reinforce the capacities in the specialization of the. Just to finish, this is the general idea from my side. The next version of the action plan will go. Should go more focused in the tackling organized crime linked to this kind of activities, and it is compulsory, needs to reinforce the capacities and in the field of criminal investigation throughout the whole chain, not only in police sector, but also prosecutors and judges. But we cannot forget the competent authorities, because we gathered a lot of intelligence from them, and we need to include the competent authorities also in this context. What I have to mention Europol as a police agency that provides coherence to this kind of investigation throughout the European Union. And well, that's all from my side. I don't know whether if I have gone too quickly, but well, it will be my pleasure to answer any question you have. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Godoy, for your intervention on the work of Guardia Civil, but also for your vision with regards to the next action plan. This wraps up also the presentation section of today's event. So on behalf of the Secretariat of the European Parliament Intergroup on Climate Change, Biodiversity and Sustainable Development, please allow me to once again thank all of our speakers for their contributions today. And on this note, I would like to provide the floor to Dr. Coleman O'Criodine, Policy Manager on Wildlife Practice at WWF International. Dr. O'Criodine is WWF's lead expert on CITES and wildlife trade issues. He coordinates and advocates WWF position at CITES COP standing committees and technical committee meetings. And I'm very happy to provide the floor directly to Coleman, who will be moderating the remaining part of the event, including the Q&A session with our audience, as well as presenting the much awaited results of our poll today. So Coleman, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Elias. I hope everybody can hear me. And I'd like to join Elias in thanking all of the speakers and all of the participants. This was a very, very rich discussion. I am also tasked with summing up, but I will devote as little time to that as possible in order that we can use as much of the remaining time as possible for the Q&A. Just before we go into the Q&A, I've also been asked to present the poll results, and I think they're visible to everyone if you click on poll in the chat column on the right hand side of your screen. But basically, to summarize, the good news for the Commission is that nobody thought, or very few people thought, certainly negligible numbers thought that no progress at all had been made. The bad news, of course, is that very few people, again, negligible amounts, thought that substantial or full progress had been made. But the the vast majority felt that some progress had been made, but not uniform across all sectors. So there are quite a few questions already in the Q&A, and I'm going to go through them. And unfortunately, and I apologize for this in advance, in the interest of time, I'm going to have to merge one or two questions that came from people who posed several questions. And unfortunately, Fabiola, you're the first in that respect. Now, you did have some questions about how we deal with corrupt Asian and African governments, and what are the plans to implement the action plan in Africa. And I think, and also, which is related to that, is the question of funding for veterinarians and researchers in third countries, many of which would inevitably be in Africa or in Asia. Perhaps, Leo, if you don't mind taking that, those questions together, please.
Thanks, Coleman. I must admit I struggled a bit with those questions. And I'm not super well placed to answer them, but I can perhaps point in the direction in which we are trying to do something about these questions. And I already hinted at that, I think, in my presentation when I referred to development cooperation, which is something which the EU and its member states do at a very large scale. We are by far the biggest donor of development assistance in general. But also we have had a focus on perhaps not specifically wildlife trafficking, but certainly some related issues in some places, and Africa for sure is one of them, where we have worked with our colleagues who manage these programs and who decide on or who collaborate with the countries in question on what use to make of those funds. We are working together with them on trying to make sure that among the many other priorities that are obviously there in those countries, the fight against wildlife trafficking, and going back even maybe one step further and making sure that we're supporting those countries in for example, managing well their protected areas, which are often very large and especially and accordingly difficult to manage. This is something that we have consistently provided funding for. Tackling corruption is a whole different can of worms, for which I don't think anyone has a panacea, but it's also obviously one of the criteria that we apply when allocating development assistance.
Okay, thank you. I would say as well, from my own knowledge, that the EU was the sponsor of a resolution on corruption in CITES, which was adopted at the 17th meeting of the Conference of the Parties in 2016. But Christian, taking up the corruption issue and also an issue about sanctioning European companies that are engaged in illegal activities outside the EU, such as in the mining sector and so on, is in the consideration of revision of the Environmental Crime Directive. Are you looking at this issue of the behavior of European countries and European legal persons in third countries? And are you also looking at the question of freezing the assets of non-EU citizens that are in the EU, that have assets in the EU, that are the proceeds of criminal or corrupt activities, whether wildlife or otherwise? Because that is something that could contribute to the fight against corruption. Actually, so just while you're typing as well, I will take up one question myself from Robert Kenward, because it is a very valid one. It's where the rubber hits the road, as we say. Are there species who have had their red list status improved due to IWT action since 2008? Well, I can name one off the top of my head, and that is the Tibetan antelope, or chiru, which is confined to what is Chinese territory, but it's a species where the market for the products is primarily a European one, and that has gone down over 2 decades. It has gone down from endangered to near through vulnerable to now reaching near threatened status. Of course, it is rather the exception than the rule, but if that is an answer to your question. So, Peter, whenever you're ready, please.
Sorry, can you repeat the question, because I was typing something else?
Oh, I beg your pardon. So 2 questions. First of all, will the Environmental Crime Directive look at environmental destruction caused outside the EU by EU companies or legal persons or natural persons? And secondly, is there scope for freezing the assets of third country citizens engaged in illegal wildlife activities or other illegal activities who have such assets in Europe?
Yeah. The first question is settled in the provision on jurisdiction.
Yeah.
Every directive on substantive criminal law in the European Union adopted on the basis of the treaty, Article 83 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the EU, regulates not only the offences, so the definition of the offences and the applicable sanctions, but usually has a provision on jurisdiction. And this provision requires that member states establish usually jurisdiction based on nationality. It's called the active nationality principle, and the territory. So offenses committed on the soil of our member states. But there can be additional grounds for jurisdiction. For example, if the offense is committed on board a ship or on board an aircraft which flies a European flag.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a tiny part of extraterritorial jurisdiction possible under this directive. If the damage occurs entirely outside the EU, the only way to hold people responsible is to prosecute them as EU nationals. EU nationals can be prosecuted for offences committed outside the EU territory, but that usually requires that national law in our member states provide for such jurisdiction.
Yeah.
And not all of our member states do so.
Yeah.
As far as proceeds of crime are concerned, yes, we can freeze, confiscate, or forfeit the proceeds of crime depending on national systems. We have EU directives, again, requiring that our member states enable the freezing, seizure, or confiscation of such proceeds for a large number of serious crimes, including crimes committed outside EU territory, provided that, again, that we prosecute and convict the criminal in the EU. If we convict an EU citizen in the EU and there are proceeds of crime to be confiscated or forfeited, I see no problem with freezing, confiscating their assets. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll take the 2 questions of, one question in particular from Beate, who is asking something that has arisen a few times in the discussion and was acknowledged by the Commission, which is where the resources for the new action plan are likely to come from. Perhaps, Leo, you could take that one, please.
Well, I wish I knew. But I guess it would help to differentiate a bit between different types of resources and different purposes to which they could be put. Because as I said, what we have been relying on so far are not like very, what is sometimes called earmarked types of funding, which are from the outset reserved for specific purposes, such as fighting wildlife trafficking. That is a rare thing. I don't see that coming along anytime soon, frankly, at EU level, although it would be quite useful. But it's difficult to see any kind of promising hook. So I think we will continue to rely mostly on more, let's say, polyvalent funding sources, which can help finance relevant measures, among other things. And then it becomes a question of prioritizing. And there, the demand is just as important as the supply. So it helps to get good project proposals, some of the successful proposals we have heard about today. It also helps to have sensitivity in third countries with which we cooperate. Usually we are very receptive if the government of a third country wants us to do something in this domain, but that's not always the case. And then, of course, very mundanely, there's the question of enabling or creating, perhaps to some extent, the relevant manpower and womanpower in our own administrations, be it at EU level or national level. That is a very difficult issue across the Commission, for which I can speak, where basically everyone is under-resourced. So not, if we say, look, we have all this work and only 0. So many people, others will say, look, we have even more and even fewer people.
Yeah, no, I understand. Okay, a question from Irvin directed at Peter, that in terms of impact, wildlife crime still gets a lower priority than excise-related actions. And is there anything that we can do to address this?
Well, member states obviously are the masters of their criminal policy, so they set priorities in accordance with national priorities. But to some extent, the European Union can and does influence these choices. For example, when we set objectives in impact for law enforcement and judicial authorities to focus on certain crime categories, and we did that. My colleagues on the panel indeed highlighted that environmental crime is now a priority for law enforcement, and we do the same through this directive when updating it for the judiciary. And we will require in that revised directive that our member states dedicate more resources to both law enforcement and judiciary, that they set up strategies to deal with environmental crime, and generally that they deal with environmental crime as a higher priority. So I expect that as a result of the revised directive, with the support of the member states and of the European Parliament, we will have a more generally homogeneous handling of environmental crime throughout the European Union in a few years.
Okay, thank you very much. I've only time for one more question because we're already running slightly late. And I'm going to really, I see that Siri asked a few questions. And one was about how member states can work more effectively against cybercrime, which I think Emily did address after the question popped up to some extent, but you may want to pick that up. But the main practical question was, what consequences were there for websites that were found to have been associated with illegal wildlife trade?
Yeah, thank you. So to answer this question, so on the specific operation that the Wildlife Cybercrime Project, I don't have myself the answer of what concrete consequences there was. That's a bit the kind of difficulties sometimes of, you collaborate between law enforcement and NGOs, but NGOs, they don't have access to all the information that law enforcers have, obviously, to not, undermine any investigative efforts. So I don't have the answer for my own operation, for the own operation of the cybercrime project, but normally what happened is that, yeah, so if it's a website which is like really solely dedicated to wildlife trafficking, which is clearly just like a wildlife trafficker website, then clearly the website will be taken down by the law enforcers. There is no really discussion on this. But usually wildlife trafficking online happens on very well-known websites and online platforms that we all know about. It's just like hidden posts here and there, sometimes in hidden groups, but most of the time in the open, and it's, you know, so much like the number of posts at every second that you have on the interweb that law enforcers can't be necessarily after each post. But in these cases, so usually when a law enforcer will spot an advert, then they will really like try to identify who is behind that advert. So it's not about the website. They are not going to ask eBay to close down, for example, but they're gonna try to follow the IP address and try to find back the person behind the website and continue their investigation on that person, if that's a recurring trend that they are posting illegal adverts online and so on. So, and those more general websites, that's why we set up the Coalition to End Wildlife Trafficking Online, to also try to make sure that those websites proactively prevent criminals from posting adverts. So they usually work with automated detection systems, algorithm that will, if you try to type ivory, let's say, for example, on eBay, it will, you know, stop you from posting your posts. And so that's one way to address it. But as I said in my presentation, one of the limits is that those are voluntary commitments from the online platforms. And that's why we believe that, to your question on what can member states do, I think it's important that there is probably an EU legislation at least, or even member state legislation, that makes sure that there is a framework on what can be, how and what can be sold online, because for the time being it's a bit the Far West. You can post anything online and there is not enough enforcement pressure. So, you know, for example, if you post an advert about CITES specimen, at the minimum you would need to put the number of the CITES certificate so that the law enforcers which is spotting this advert can trace back and liaise with the CITES management authority to ask whether there is indeed a certificate, and this is whether this is the right certificate for the specimen. For now, you see a lot on those specialized platforms for selling reptiles or birds, for example. You see a lot of adverts, but there is no information on the source of the specimen, on whether there is a CITES permit, on the legality of it. And I think at the minimum, there needs to be these requirements, and it needs to be done by law, because as I said, as long as there is not this legislative pressure, several of the platforms won't necessarily want to make any voluntary commitments.
Okay, thank you. We're on the hour now, so I have to be very, very brief in summing up and leave out some of the things I was going to say. So just one of the things that came across to me from a number of the presentations, and it relates to a point that Espen made about awareness raising among lawyers, and Emily and others talking about training. I think something that I've learned from talking to people in the enforcement community is that the low number of wildlife cases that are taken is a barrier to achieving their success. In other crime sectors where police and other enforcement authorities have much more practice and much more of a routine of taking cases to court, they know where the roadblocks are, they know the potential defenses and so on, and they're better equipped, and the judiciary are better equipped. So the most important thing we can do, I would suggest, to build capacity is to learn by doing. We also came out with yet again, the need to follow the money, the need to use what constitutional powers member states have to the maximum. In the jurisdiction of my own home country, we have relatively good legislation on that point. I won't say we have it on other points, which provides for non-conviction based asset seizure, and it is seen as one of the model countries. That's Ireland, for those of you who haven't recognized the accent. I think something else to say is that I personally would agree, and I think everybody would agree with the assessment, or most people would agree with the assessment, that some progress was made. It also seems to me, with the action plan, it also seems to me that the reasons why progress wasn't made uniformly across all aspects of it, some of them have been quite correctly identified here: the need for more resources, the need for more monitoring and evaluation, and more concrete targets. And one other point that's important to bring up is that member states really are the masters. They vary in terms of their political will, in terms of their sentencing practice, and so on. And until we achieve more harmonization there, as Peter pointed out, we are always going to be struggling. And on the point about sentence levels, for instance, and it is worth recalling, if we're saying, as we are, that this is organized crime, then the UN Convention on Transnational Organized Crime includes in its definition of this term that the activity should carry, the crime should carry as sentence level, maximum sentence level greater than 4 years, and many member states don't meet that criterion for wildlife crime. So that is something to reflect on. Now, I realize I've gone slightly over the times, so with that, I can only say thank you again to all of the speakers and to the participants. Thank you to those who had to field difficult questions, and thanks to the organizers and everybody associated with this event. I learned a lot, and I hope all of you did too. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day and your weekend. Goodbye.